On Democracy by Robert A. Dahl, voiced by the Catalyst Gamer. Chapter 10, Varieties 2, Constitutions. Just as democracy comes in different sizes, so too democratic constitutions come in a variety of styles and forms. But, you might well ask, do differences in the constitutions of democratic countries really matter? The answer, it seems, is no, yes, and maybe. To explain why, I'll begin by drawing mainly on the constitutional experience of the older democracies, countries where the basic democratic institutions have existed continuously since about 1950, 22 in all. Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, Costa Rica, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Iceland, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Japan, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The variations among them are sufficient to provide a fair idea of the range of possibilities. The constitutional arrangements of newly democratized countries, however, are no less important. Indeed, they may be even more, because they can be crucial to the success of democratization. In describing constitutions and constitutional arrangements, I wish to use these terms broadly so as to include important practices that may not be specified in the Constitution, such as electoral and party systems. My reason for doing so will become clear in the next chapter. What then are the important variations in democratic constitutions, and how much do they matter? Written or unwritten? An unwritten constitution may seem to be a contradiction in terms, yet, in a few countries, certain well-established institutions and practices are understood as comprising the constitutional system, even though they are not prescribed in a single document adopted as a country's constitution. Among the older democracies, and surely among the newer ones, an unwritten constitution is a result of a highly unusual historic circumstances, as it was in three exceptional cases as Great Britain, Israel, and New Zealand. The adoption of written constitution has, however, become the standard practice. Bill of Rights. Does the Constitution include an explicit Bill of Rights? Again, although an explicit constitutional Bill of Rights is not universal among older democracies, it is now standard practice. For historical reasons, and because of the absence of a written constitution, the notable exception has been Britain, where, however, there is significant support for the idea. Social and economic rights. Although the American Constitution and those of that survive from the 19th century in the older democratic countries generally have little to say explicitly about social and economic rights, those adopted since World War II typically do include them. Sometimes, however, the social and economic rights prescribed, occasionally at great strength, are little more than symbolic. Federal or unitary? In a federal system, the government of certain smaller territorial units, states, provinces, regions, are guaranteed permanence and a significant range of authority. In unitary systems, their existence and authority depends on decisions by the national government. Among the 22 older democratic countries, only 6 are strictly federal: Australia, Austria, Canada, Germany, Switzerland, and the United States. In all 6 countries, federalism is the result of special historical circumstances. Unicameral or bicameral legislature. Although bicameralism predominates, Israel has never had a second chamber, and since 1950 the 4 Scandinavian countries, Finland and New Zealand, have abolished their upper houses. Judicial review. Can a Supreme Court declare unconditional laws properly enacted by the national legislature? This practice, known as judicial review, has been a standard feature in democratic countries with federal systems, where it seemed as necessary if the national constitution is to prevail over laws enacted by the states, provinces or cantons. But the more relevant issue is whether a court can declare a law enacted by the national parliament unconstitutional. Switzerland, in fact, limits the power of judicial review only to cantonal legislation. As we have just seen, however, most democratic countries are not federal, and among the unitary systems only about half have some form of judicial review. Moreover, even among countries where judicial review does exist, the extent to which attempts to exercise this power varies from the extreme case, the United States, where the Supreme Court sometimes wield extraordinary power, to countries where the judiciary is highly deferential to the decisions of the Parliament. Canada provides an interesting variant. A federal system, Canada has a Supreme Court endowed with the authority to declare both provincial and federal laws unconstitutional. The provincial legislators and the federal parliament can override the court's decision, however, by voting a second time to pass the act in question. Tenure of judges for life or limited term. In the United States, members of the federal, that is, the national, judiciary are, by constitutional provision, given life tenure. The advantage of life tenure is to ensure judges greater independence from political pressures. But if the 19th and early 20th century, they do have the power of judicial review. Their judgments may reflect the influence of an old ideology and no longer supported by popular and legislature majorities. Consequently, they may employ judicial review to impede reforms, as they sometimes have in the United States. Famously, during the Great Reform period from 1933 to 1937, under the leadership of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, with an American experience in view, some democratic countries that have explicitly provided for judicial review in constitutions written after World War II have rejected life tenure and instead have chosen to provide for limited, though lengthy terms, as in Germany, Italy, and Japan. Referenda. Are national referenda possible? Or, in the case of constitutional amendments, perhaps obligatory? Switzerland provides the limiting case. There, referenda on national issues are permissible, obligatory for constitutional amendments, and frequent. At the other extreme, the US Constitution makes no provision for referenda, and no national referenda has ever been held, although they are common in many states. In contrast to the United States, however, in more than half the older democracies, a referendum has been held at least once. Presidential or parliamentary? In a presidential system, the chief executive is elected independently of the legislature and is constitutionally vested with important powers. In a parliamentary or cabinet system, the chief executive is chosen and may be removed by the parliament. The classic example of presidential government is the United States. The classic example of parliamentary government is Great Britain. Presidential government was invented by the delegates to American Constitutional Convention in 1787. Most of the delegates admired the British Unwritten Constitution for its separation of powers into a judiciary independent of both the legislature and the executive, a legislature parliament independent of the executive, and an executive, the monarchy, independent of the legislature. Although the delegates sought to emulate the virtues of the British Constitution, a monarch was clearly out of the question, so they were stumped by the problem of the executive. Left with no relevant historical models, they wrestled over the question for almost 2 months before producing their solution. Although the Constitution was an extraordinary assembly of constitutional talent, the passage of time has endowed the delegates with far greater foresight than the historical records reveal to us, or the human fallibilities would seem to allow. As with many inventions, the originators of the American presidential system, or better, presidential congressional system, could not possibly foresee how their creation would evolve over the next 2 centuries. Nor could they foresee that parliamentary government was just about to develop as an alternative, a more widely adopted solution. Although by now parliamentary government is all but unthinkable among Americans, had their constitutional convention been held some 30 years later, it is altogether possible that the delegates would have proposed a parliamentary system. For what they, and for that matter other observers in Britain as well, did not understand was that the British constitutional system was itself undergoing rapid change. In short, it was evolving into a parliamentary system in which executive authority would effectively rest with the Prime Minister and Cabinet, not with the monarch. And though nominally chosen by the monarch, the Prime Minister would, in actuality, be chosen by the majority in Parliament. In due time, the House of Commons, and would remain in office only with the support of a parliamentary majority. The Prime Minister, in turn, would choose the other members of the Cabinet. This system was pretty much in place by about 1810. As it turned out, in most of the older, stable democratic countries of today, where democratic institutions evolved during the 19th and early 20th centuries, and endured, variants of the parliamentary government, not presidential government, came to be the accepted constitutional agreement. Electoral system. How precisely are seats in national legislature allocated in proportion to the preferences of voters in elections? For example, will a party whose candidates get, say, 30% of the votes in an election gain close to 30% of the seats? Or might they win only 15% or so? Although the electoral system need not be specified in the Constitution, in a strict sense, as I suggested earlier, it is useful to consider it a part of the constitutional system, because of the way the electoral systems interact with other parts of the Constitution. More about this subject in the next chapter. Although the list of alternatives could be extended even further, it is surely enough to show that constitutional arrangements among the older democracies vary widely. Moreover, the variations I have mentioned are rather general. If we were to move to a more concrete level of observation, we would discover further important differences. So, you might now conclude the constitutions of democratic countries differ in important ways. But do variations make some constitutions better, or perhaps more democratic? Is there perhaps one best type of democratic constitution? These questions raise yet another. How are we to appraise the relative desirability of different constitutions? Evidently, we need some criteria. How constitutions make a difference. Constitutions might matter to a country's democracy in many ways. Stability. A constitution might help to provide stability for the basic democratic political institutions, described in Chapter 8. It could not only lay down democratic framework of government, but also ensure all the necessary rights and guarantees that the basic political institutions require. Fundamental rights. A constitution might protect the majority of and minority rights, even though this criterion is implicitly included in the first, because of variations among democratic constitutions. It is useful to give special attention to the basic rights and duties that provide guarantees for both majorities and minorities. Now, neutrality. A constitution could maintain neutrality among the country's citizens. Having ensured fundamental rights and duties, the constitutional arrangements could also ensure that the process of making law is designed neither to favour nor to penalise the views of legitimate interests of any citizen or group of citizens. Accountability. The Constitution could be designed to enable citizens to hold political leaders accountable for their decisions, actions, and conduct within a reasonable interval of time. Fair representation. What constitutes fair representation? In a democracy, is the subject of endless controversy. In part, it bears on the next two criteria. Informed consensus. A constitution might help citizens and leaders to develop an informed consensus on laws and policies. It could do so by creating opportunities and incentives for political leaders to engage in negotiations, accommodation, and coalition building that would facilitate the conciliation of diverse interests. More about this in chapters to come. Effective government. By effectiveness, I mean that a government acts so to deal with what citizens understand to be the majority issues and problems they confront, and for which they believe government action is appropriate. Effective government is particularly important in times of great emergency brought on by war, the threat of war, acute international tension, severe economic hardship, and similar crises. But it is also relevant in more ordinary times, when major issues head the agendas of citizens and leaders. To be sure, in the short run, a non-democratic government might sometimes meet this criterion better than a democratic government, though whether it would do so in the long run seems more doubtful. In any case, we are concerned with governments functioning within democratic limits. With those limits, it seems reasonable to want a constitutional system that has procedures to discourage protracted deadlock, delay, or evasion in confronting major issues and encourage taking action to deal with them. Competent decisions. Desirable as effective government may be, we would hardly admire a constitution that facilitates decisive and resolute action, yet makes it hard for a government to draw on the best knowledge available for solving the urgent problems on the country's agenda. Decisive action is no substitute for wise policy. Transparency and comprehensibility. By this pair of criteria, I mean that the operation of the government is sufficiently open to public view, and simple enough in its essentials that citizens can rapidly understand how and what it is doing. Thus it might be some complexly constructed that citizens cannot understand what is going on, and because they do not understand their government, cannot readily hold their leaders accountable, particularly in elections. Resiliency. A constitutional system needs to be so rigidly constructed or so immutably fixed in writing and tradition that it cannot be adapted to novel situations. Legitimacy. Meeting the previous 10 criteria would surely go a long way towards providing a constitution with sufficient legitimacy and allegiance among citizens and political elites to ensure its survival. Yet in a specific country, certain constitutional arrangements could be more compatible than could others with widespread traditional norms of legitimacy. For example, paradoxical though it may seem to many Republicans, maintaining a monarch as head of the state and yet adapting the monarchy to the requirements of polyarchy has conferred additional legitimacy on democratic constitutions in the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, Japan, Spain, and Britain. In most democratic countries, by contrast, an attempt to blend a monarch as head of state would clash with widespread republican beliefs. Thus Alexander Hamilton's proposal at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 for an executive with life tenure an elective monarchy was rejected almost without debate. As another delegate, Elbridge Gerry, remarked, "There were not 1,000th parts of our fellow citizens who were not aghast every approach towards monarchy." I think that's meant to say against. How much of a difference do the differences make? Do constitutional differences like these really matter? To answer this question, we need to add 2 more bodies of evidence to that of the 22 older democratic countries. One collection of experiences can be drawn from the newer democracies, countries in which the basic democratic institutions were established and maintained during the second half of the 20th century. Another consists of the tragic but illuminating history of countries in which the democratic institutions were established at some point in the 20th century, but broke down and yielded, at least for a time, to the authoritarian regime. Although these 3 immense sources of evidence are by no means fully reported or analyzed, I believe that they produce some important conclusions. To begin with, each of the constitutional alternatives listed earlier has existed in at least one stable democracy. Consequently, it is perfectly reasonable, indeed logically necessary, to conclude that many different constitutional arrangements are compatible with the basic political institutions of polyarchical democracy that were described in Chapter 8. The polyarchical institutions of polyarchical democracy can, it appears, take many specific forms. Why is this so? Certain underlying conditions highly favorable to the stability of the basic democratic institutions, discussed in Chapter 12, have prevailed in all these older and highly stable democracies. Given these favorable conditions, constitutional variations like those I have described have no great effect on the stability of the basic democratic institutions. Judged solely by that criterion, the variations I've described don't appear to matter. Within broad limits, then, democratic countries have a wide choice of constitutions. In contrast, where the underlying conditions are highly unfavorable, it is improbable that democracy could be preserved by any constitutional design. With only slight exaggeration, we might summarize the first 2 points like this. If the underlying conditions are highly favorable, stability is likely, with almost any constitution the country is likely to adopt. If the underlying conditions are highly unfavorable, no constitution will save democracy. There is, however, a third and more intriguing possibility. In a country where the conditions are neither highly favorable nor highly unfavorable, but mixed, so that democracy is chancy, but by no means impossible, the choice of constitutional design might matter. In brief, if the underlying conditions in a country are mixed, and some are favorable but others are unfavorable, a well-designed constitution might help democratic institutions to survive, whereas a badly designed constitution might contribute to the breakdown of democratic institutions. Finally, crucially as it is, stability isn't the only relevant criterion. If we were to judge constitutional arrangements by other criteria, they might have important consequences, even in countries where conditions are highly favorable to democratic stability. And they do. They shape the concrete political institutions of democratic countries: executives, legislators, courts, party systems, local governments, and so on. The shape of these institutions might in turn have important consequences for the fairness of the representation in the legislature or the effectiveness of the government, and as a result they might even affect the legitimacy of the government. In countries where the underlying conditions are mixed and the prospects for democratic stability are somewhat uncertain, these variations might prove to be exceptionally important. Indeed, this does appear to be the case, for reasons we explore in the next chapter.